Section 62 of Villette by Charlotte Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leanne Fortune. Section 62. Besides Fifine Beck's mother, another power had a word to say to Monsieur Paul and me, before that covenant of friendship could be ratified. We were under the surveillance of a sleepless eye. Rome watched jealously her son through that mystic lattice, at which I had knelt once, and to which Monsieur Emmanuel drew nigh month by month, the sliding panel of the confessional. "Why were you so glad to be friends with Monsieur Paul?" asks the reader. "Had he not long been a friend to you? Had he not given proof on proof of a certain partiality in his feelings?" Yes, he had, but still I liked to hear him say so earnestly that he was my close true friend. I liked his modest doubts, his tender deference, that trust which longed to rest, and was grateful when taught how. He had called me sister. It was well. Yes, he might call me what he pleased, so long as he confided in me. I was willing to be his sister, on condition that he did not invite me to fill that relation to some future wife of his, and tacitly vowed as he was to celibacy. Of this dilemma there seemed little danger. Through most of the succeeding night I pondered that evening's interview. I wanted much the morning to break, and then listened for the bell to ring, and, after rising and dressing, I deemed prayers and breakfast slow, and all the hours lingering, till that arrived at last which brought me the lesson of literature. My wish was to get a more thorough comprehension of this fraternal alliance, to note with how much of the brother he would demean himself when we met again, to prove how much of the sister was in my own feelings, to discover whether I could summon a sister's courage, and he a brother's frankness. He came. Life is so constructed that the event does not, cannot, will not match the expectation. That whole day he never accosted me. His lesson was given rather more quietly than usual, more mildly, and also more gravely. He was fatherly to his pupils, but he was not brotherly to me. Ere he left the class, I expected a smile, if not a word. I got neither. To my portion fell one nod, hurried, shy. This distance, I argued, is accidental, it is involuntary. Patience, and it will vanish. It vanished not. It continued for days. It increased. I suppressed my surprise, and swallowed whatever other feelings began to surge. Well might I ask when he offered fraternity, "Dare I rely on you?" Well might he, doubtless knowing himself, withhold all pledge. True, he had bid me make my own experiments, tease and try him. Vain injunction. Privilege nominal and unavailable. Some women might use it. Nothing in my powers or instinct placed me amongst this brave band. Left alone, I was passive, repulsed, I withdrew. Forgotten, my lips would not utter, nor my eyes dart a reminder. It seemed there had been an error somewhere in my calculations, and I wanted for time to disclose it. But the day came when, as usual, he was to give me a lesson. One evening in 7 he had long generously bestowed on me, devoting it to the examination of what had been done in various studies during the past week, and to the preparation of work for the week in prospect. On these occasions my schoolroom was anywhere, wherever the pupils and the other teachers happened to be, or in their close vicinage, very often in the large second division, where it was easy to choose a quiet nook when the crowding day pupils were absent, and the few boarders gathered in a knot about the surveillance estrade. On the customary evening, hearing the customary hour strike, I collected my books and papers, my pen and ink, and sought the large division. In class there was no one, and it lay all in cool deep shadow, but through the open double doors was seen the carré, filled with pupils and with light. Over hall and figures blushed the westering sun. It blushed so ruddily and vividly that the hues of the walls and the variegated tints of the dresses seemed all fused in one warm glow. The girls were seated, working or studying. In the midst of their circle stood Monsieur Manuel, speaking good-humouredly to a teacher. His dark paletot, his jetty hair, were tinged with many a reflex of crimson. His Spanish face, when he turned it momentarily, answered the sun's animated kiss with an animated smile. I took my place at a desk. The orange trees and several plants, full and bright with bloom, basked also in the sun's laughing bounty. They had partaken it the whole day, and now asked water. Monsieur Manuel had a taste for gardening. He liked to tend and foster plants. I used to think that working amongst shrubs with a spade or a watering pot soothed his nerves. It was a recreation to which he often had recourse, and now he looked to the orange trees, the geraniums, the gorgeous cactuses, and revived them all with the refreshment their drought needed. His lips, meantime, sustained his precious cigar, that, for him, first necessary and prime luxury of life. Its blue wreaths curled prettily enough amongst the flowers, and in the evening light. He spoke no more to the pupils, nor to the mistresses, but gave many an endearing word to a small spanieless, if one may coin a word, that nominally belonged to the house, but virtually owned him as master, being fonder of him than any inmate. A delicate, sulky, loving, and lovable little doggie she was, trotting at his side, looking with expressive, attached eyes into his face, and whenever he dropped his bonnet grec or his handkerchief, which he occasionally did in play, crouching beside it with the air of a miniature lion guarding a kingdom's flag. There were many plants, and as the amateur gardener fetched all the water from the well in the court, with his own active hands, his work spun on to some length. The great school clock ticked on. Another hour struck. The carré and the youthful group lost the illusion of sunset. Day was drooping. My lesson, I perceived, must to-night be very short, but the orange trees, the cacti, the camellias were all served now. Was it my turn? Alas! In the garden were more plants to be looked after, favourite rose bushes, certain choice flowers. Little Sylvie's glad bark and whine followed the receding paletot down the alleys. I put up some of my books. I should not want them all. I sat and thought, and waited, involuntarily deprecating the creeping invasion of twilight. Sylvie, gaily frisking, emerged into view once more, heralding the returning paletot. The watering pot was deposited beside the well. It had fulfilled its office. How glad I was! Monsieur washed his hands in a little stone bowl. There was no longer time for a lesson now. Ere long the prayer bell must ring, but still we should meet. He would speak. A chance would be offered of reading in his eyes the riddle of his shyness. His ablutions over, he stood, slowly rearranging his cuffs, looking at the horn of a young moon set pale in the opal sky, and glimmering faint on the aureole of Jean Baptiste. Sylvie watched the mood, contemplative. Its stillness irked her. She whined and jumped to break it. He looked down. "Petite exigeante," said he. "You must not be forgotten one moment, it seems." He stopped, lifted her in his arms, sauntered across the court, within a yard of the line of windows near one of which I sat. He sauntered lingeringly, fondling the spaniel in his bosom, calling her tender names in a tender voice. On the front door steps he turned. Once again he looked at the moon, at the grey cathedral, over the remoter spires and house roofs, fading into a blue sea of night mist, he tasted the sweet breath of dusk, and noted the folded bloom of the garden. He suddenly looked round. A keen beam out of his eye raised the white facade of the classes, swept the long line of croisées. I think he bowed. If he did, I had no time to return the courtesy. In a moment he was gone. The moonlit threshold lay pale and shadowless before the closed front door. Gathering in my arms all that was spread on the desk before me, I carried back the unused heap to its place in the third class. The prayer bell rang. I obeyed its summons. The morrow would not restore him to the Rue Fossette, that day being devoted entirely to his college. I got through my teaching. I got over the intermediate hours. I saw evening approaching, and armed myself for its heavy ennui. Whether it was worse to stay with my co-inmates or to sit alone, I had not considered. I naturally took up the latter alternative. If there was a hope of comfort for any moment, the heart or head of no human being in this house could yield it. Only under the lid of my desk could it harbour, nestling between the leaves of some book, gilding a pencil point, the nib of a pen, or tinging the black fluid in that ink glass. With a heavy heart I opened my desk lid. With a weary hand I turned up its contents. One by one, well-accustomed books, volumes sewn in familiar covers, were taken out and put back hopeless. They had no charm. They could not comfort. Is this something new? This pamphlet in lilac? I had not seen it before. And I rearranged my desk this very day, this very afternoon. The tract must have been introduced within the last hour, while we were at dinner. I opened it. What was it? What would it say to me? It was neither tale nor poem, neither essay nor history. It neither sung nor related, not discussed. It was a theological work. It preached and it persuaded. I lent to it my ear very willingly, for, small as it was, it possessed its own spell, and bound my attention at once. It preached Romanism. It persuaded to conversion. The voice of that sly little book was a honeyed voice. Its accents were all unction and balm. Here roared no utterance of Rome's thunders, no blasting of the breath of her displeasure. The Protestant was to turn Papist, not so much in fear of the heretic's hell, as on account of the comfort, the indulgence, the tenderness Holy Church offered. Far be it from her to threaten or to coerce. Her wish was to guide and win. She persecute? Oh dear, no, not on any account. This meek volume was not addressed to the hardened and worldly. It was not even strong meat for the strong. It was milk for babes. The mild effluence of a mother's love towards her tenderest and her youngest, intended wholly and solely for those whose head is to be reached through the heart. Its appeal was not to intellect. It sought to win the affectionate through their affections, the sympathizing through their sympathies. St. Vincent de Paul, gathering his orphans about him, never spoke more sweetly. I remember one capital inducement to apostasy was held out in the fact that the Catholic, who had lost dear friends by death, could enjoy the unspeakable solace of praying them out of purgatory. The writer did not touch on the firmer peace of those whose belief dispenses with purgatory altogether, but I thought of this, and on the whole preferred the latter doctrine as the most consolatory. The little book amused and did not painfully displease me. It was a canting, sentimental, shallow little book, yet something about it cheered my gloom and made me smile. I was amused with the gambols of this unlicked wolf cub muffled in the fleece, and mimicking the bleat of a gulless lamb. Portions of it reminded me of certain Wesleyan Methodist tracts I had once read when a child. They were flavored with about the same seasoning of excitation to fanaticism. He that had written it was no bad man, and while perpetually betraying the trained cunning, the cloven hoof of his system, I should pause before accusing himself of insincerity. His judgment, however, wanted surgical props. It was rickety. I smiled then over this dose of maternal tenderness, coming from the ruddy old lady of the 7 Hills, smiled too at my own disinclination, not to say disability, to meet these melting favors. Glancing at the title page, I found the name of Père Silas. A fly-leaf bore in small but clear and well-known pencil characters, from P.C.D.E. to Lucy. And when I saw this, I laughed, but not in my former spirit. I was revived. A mortal bewilderment cleared suddenly from my head and vision. The solution of the Sphinx riddle was one. The conjunction of those two names, Père Silas and Paul Emmanuel, gave the key to all. The penitent had been with his director, permitted to withhold nothing, suffered to keep no corner of his heart sacred to God and to himself. The whole narrative of our late interview had been drawn from him. He had avowed the covenant of fraternity and spoken of his adopted sister. How could such a covenant, such adoption, be sanctioned by the Church? Fraternal communion with a heretic! I seemed to hear Père Silas annulling the unholy pact, warning his penitent of its perils, entreating, enjoining reserve, nay, by the authority of his office, and in the name, and by the memory of all Monsieur Emmanuel held most dear and sacred, commanding the enforcement of that new system whose frost had pierced to the marrow of my bones. These may not seem pleasant hypotheses, yet by comparison they were welcome. The vision of a ghostly troubler hovering in the background was as nothing matched with the fear of spontaneous change arising in Monsieur Paul himself. At this distance of time, I cannot be sure how far the above conjectures were self-suggested, or in what measure they owed their origin and confirmation to another quarter. Help was not wanting. This evening there was no bright sunset. West and east were one cloud. No summer night mist, blue yet rose-tinged, softened the distance. A clammy fog from the marshes crept grey round Villette. To-night the watering-pot might rest in its niche by the well. A small rain had been drizzling all the afternoon, and still it fell fast and quietly. This was no weather for rambling in the wet alleys, under the dripping trees, and I started to hear Sylvie's sudden bark in the garden, her bark of welcome. Surely she was not accompanied, and yet this glad, quick bark was never uttered save in homage to one presence. Through the glass door and the arching berceau I commanded the deep vista of the Allée d'Enfants. Thither rushed Sylvie, glistening through its gloom like a white guelder rose. She ran to and fro, whining, springing, harassing little birds amongst the bushes. I watched 5 minutes. No fulfillment followed the omen. I returned to my books. Sylvie's sharp bark suddenly ceased. Again I looked up. She was standing not many yards distant, wagging her white feathery tail as fast as the muscle would work, and intently watching the operations of a spade, plied fast by an indefatigable hand. There was Monsieur Emmanuel, bent over the soil, digging in the wet mold amongst the rain-laden and streaming shrubs, working as hard as if his day's pittance were yet to earn by the literal sweat of his brow. End of section 62, recording by Leanne Fortune.